Welcome to Bobby Owsinski's Inner Circle. I'm Bobby Owsinski, and this is a show all about music, music production, and the music business. My guest today is film composer and educator Chris Boardman. First of all, radio is changing, and it's changing big time. There's something new on the horizon, and it's called virtual radio. And it's not necessarily something that you're going to notice immediately, but behind the scenes, there's a lot going on. Essentially, what radio stations are trying to do is eliminate the local studio. So they're putting a lot on the cloud. And this even means local programming, so things like listener calls and local interviews and even the library of advertising and music that they're using will all go into one place. Now, what this does, it reduces the engineering and the equipment costs, but what also happens is things get even a little more homogenized. Yeah, we didn't think that could happen, But it looks like we're heading the way of less and less local programming and specific local programming and more centrally located network programming. That being said, there's also another change coming to radio. And that is, most radio stations are going to begin to record video of the radio broadcasts. So in other words, you'll be able to see the radio personality. Whether that's good or bad, I'm not sure, but it definitely works for network shows. Lots of sports shows do simulcasts. But I think you're going to see it more and more, even on a local level. One of the big problems with this, of course, is it's easy enough to do radio. It's easy enough to do audio. The real hard part is the editing. But apparently there's some smart technology that's driving switching and driving all of the elements that are traditionally very difficult to do in video. So we'll see how that works. But one thing that's happening for sure is the line is beginning to blur between TV and radio. If you have any questions or comments, send them to questions@BobbyOInnerCircle.com. Check out my Hitmakers Club for access to the Private Mixers Facebook group, monthly deconstructed hits, mixing workshop, and Q&A webinars. For a short time, access to my core training module bonus. Go to hitmakersclub.com to learn more. Now, we all have a lot of gear. Some of us have more gear than others. And that begs the question, do you have insurance for your gear? Many of us think, well, wait a second, I have homeowners or renters insurance, and doesn't that cover it? Well, not necessarily, just like your car insurance may not cover it if you're going out to a gig with your gear. So for instance, what ends up happening is your homeowners or renters insurance generally won't cover anything that's outside of the home, first of all. But even if you have a home studio, for instance, and something occurs within that studio, if you're making money with it, or if the insurance company deems that it's some sort of a business, guess what? They're not going to pay on it. And the same thing happens with your car insurance. If you're out on a gig and you're making money from it, then it's likely that the insurance company will not pay on any claims. So, that being said, there are other problems as well. Even if they do decide to pay, are they going to pay the true replacement value of your gear? So for instance, let's say you have a guitar that you bought in, 1975. And this guitar, in fact, cost you $350 back then, but is now worth $3,500. Well, do you think the insurance company is going to pay you $3,500? Probably not, because the insurance agent is not sophisticated in these things. Same with computer gear, for instance. If you have a computer that's loaded up with $5,000 worth of plugins, for instance, chances are that the insurance company will only pay on the value of that computer. So that's why it's really important that you get dedicated equipment insurance. And that being said, it's not as expensive as you might think. It's only about $80 per $1,000 of gear that you're insuring, so it's not that bad. The other thing you might consider if you're out gigging, or even if you own a home studio where you're bringing in clients all the time, you might want a public liability insurance policy that protects against any lawsuits in case someone trips or gets electrocuted, or any of those bad things happen, or if a musician that you hire runs into a problem and decides to sue, then you'll find that this public liability, this umbrella insurance policy is going to protect you. So these are all things to think about when it comes to insurance. We don't like to think about these things, but it's really important that you have it. My guest this week is film composer Chris Boardman, who was one of my first guests when I started the podcast 4 years ago. He was originally on episode number 11. Acknowledged for his work in film, television, records, and academia, Chris is a 6-time Emmy Award winner with 13 Emmy nominations and has also been nominated for an Oscar. He has multiple platinum records and has twice been nominated for Mentor of the Year by the University of Miami Graduate School. In this interview, we talked about the evolution of the film scoring business, as well as his new master's level film scoring course. We spoke via Skype from his home in Nashville. It was 4 years ago when we did the first interview. I think you were episode number 13. I'm sure things have changed in the film composition business since then. Maybe not. Has the process changed at all?
Well, this is a pretty hot topic at the moment. You know, in that period of time, the culture and the business has changed. And also technology has changed. So it's kind of reminiscent of the onset of MySpace, where in the 90s we had record companies trying to limit the number of releases to maximize profits and thereby restrict choice. And when, as you probably recall, when MySpace took off, all of a sudden there was 3 million fan pages. So it was a place for all the garage bands of the world to aggregate to show their wares. There's obviously not that many that were really great, but they were out there. In today's world, what I see is a lot of people enamored and for various reasons, for business reasons, for personal reasons, for passion reasons, whatever, to want to write music for media. And the tools have never been cheaper. So there's a flood of people who want to do this kind of work. Are they any good? Well, some, probably the same percentages as before. The basic process of writing music for film hasn't changed substantially other than what the technology and digital audio workstations will allow. So it's that part is kind of stabilized but we have this influx of people who want to do this job. And the curious thing is Hollywood continues to contract and under serious threat by Amazon and Netflix. So it's kind of creating this environment where there's more projects to score, less of a budget to make a living at it, or at least what we expected to be paid 20 years ago. And we got more people who want to do it. So it kind of falls in line with my attitude then, which is the people who really know what they are doing will rise above, they'll stand out, but it's become more and more a volume business than an exclusive business, if that makes any sense. So
volume meaning that you have to do more projects in order to make a living than before, right?
Correct. So what I've focused on in my teaching is giving people a smattering of all the job descriptions so that they can do lower cost projects and keep more money in their pocket and be able to work across borders, because it's no longer a domestic market only being shipped out across the world. We have people making, more of a local-based business, if anything, or a niche-based business.
I have a good friend that works for NASA. He's a rocket scientist, but he started out his career as a punk bass player and never gave up his love for music. But as it turns out, he posted something online that was found by Bollywood. And now he does all this Bollywood scoring on the side because they just love what he does, which is the perfect example of what you're just talking about.
Yeah, I think we'll see more and more of that. You know, in the MySpace era, you know, when I really discovered when we met how pervasive this change that we were experiencing would be, I tried to understand what would be the determining factor, what would be the value proposition that would drive people to one piece of music or to a different, you know, whatever it was, you know, it's because all the rules were changing. And that was, my Lord, that was 10, 12, 14 years ago. I think that we're with the Parkland shooting and the teens who are organizing to change their world we're right today. I mean, my opinions are changing because the world is changing. We're saying we need to do something about the world. Art is part of that world, and so it's all going to shift. And it seems like the value proposition for film scoring, music, etc., is going to be what is the authentic experience that the music creates. Because I just 20 minutes ago read an article about how Generation Z is bored looking at their cell phone. They're looking for something else. So it kind of strikes me as saying that, well, there has to be real value to be able to connect, and we're going to seems to be that the potential exists for new filters to emerge that will act in the way that it did in the 20th century to be able to identify those performers, those filmmakers, those film composers that can connect people by the use of their art in ways that we haven't necessarily imagined yet, but fulfill that need for an authentic connection between human beings.
What's the difference between scoring for a movie and scoring for a television show and or scoring for a video game?
Oh, well, anything that's in a linear, what you described is two examples of a linear process as opposed to an adaptive music process. A linear process means that somebody else is in control of the timeline. And then the composer has to fit their music to fit that timeline. And that's the way that music has been used in film since 1928. And Jerry Goldsmith was fond of saying he's not an artist, he's a craftsman. He has to craft his music to fit that particular timeline. In a video game, it's called adaptive music, where the user is in control of the timeline. So the music has to be created in layers that are triggered based on the user's gameplay to signify, to represent where they happen to be in the game process. So it's kind of apples and oranges. The wild thing is that the 18th century tonal music conventions remain the same. It's just a different format in terms of how do you organize that information.
So you're saying it's all organization then? Well,
it's organization, but it's different. But what I'm trying to say is that the tools remain the same. I mean, harmony, harmonic progressions, melody, counterpoint, rhythmic variation, all of those elements that were manipulated by the composers of orchestral music through the last 300 years remain the same. They're just applied differently in a layered, stacked kind of process.
Well, how about composition for virtual reality? Since your reality is 360 degrees, does that influence how the music is composed?
Well, I've studied it. I've never done it myself, but it's interesting. I looked at it from a recording point of view, and they have what's called emitters. So in a traditional music sense, we're dealing with stereo and panning in a 360-degree environment, as I understand it to be. There are emitters that will be triggered based on where you're looking or where you happen to be in that 360-degree environment. So it changes the process in that regard, in that you're recording all mono instead of trying to create this pleasant stereo blend, if you will. As far as the music being composed, it's a funny thing. We have, as a culture, been conditioned to respond to different sounds in different ways. Kind of goes back to fight or flight. If a loud noise will startle you, and do I go investigate it? Do I run away from it? Do I stand my ground? That kind of moves. That's part of the human experience. In the film music, it began in Berlioz with 37, I believe, introduced the concept of leitmotif, which means musical figures attached to characters and developed as a part of a characterization. That's what we've all been conditioned to respond to. Low sounds is ominous. Major seventh chords and bells and celestes is kind of frothy, and, pick your adjective. I don't believe at this point that those conventions will go away, regardless of the format. So from a compositional point of view, you're adapting those compositional techniques to the different format, the different environment, because it's the emotional response of the audience is culturally driven, and you can't get away from that. People will be confused as opposed to knowing what it is they're supposed to feel.
Okay, so if that's culturally driven, would that vary then in different cultures? What our triggers are in Western society might be different in Cambodia or Japan, or, you pick the place. Is that true, or is it mostly universal?
I would have to think that it's universal, but the individual definitions, if you will, the identities would be different. And it's an interesting phenomenon how register plays a huge factor in that kind of recognition of an emotion or a trigger of an emotional response. So if you're in Bali or you're in Bollywood or you're in Africa, a low drum is going to probably mean the same as opposed to some high-pitched sound. But the actual harmonic and melodic content and rhythmic content could change to fit that particular culture.
Okay, that makes sense. There are so many people that want to get into film composition, and you weren't into them all day long in school, obviously. But that being said, I find that I'm approached so much, especially when I travel and I go to a college in a different country. There are theory instructors. There are people that come out of the woodwork and basically say, can you help me get a job as a film composer in Hollywood? Of course, I know nothing about it, but that brings the question then, what is the background that is required for someone to actually be successful in the business?
Well, my take on that is, and based on my experience, painful personal experience, mind you, is that musicians occupy one mindset, and is focused through sound and their own emotions or whatever is triggering that response. And that's their orientation. It's about the music. The single most important thing that anyone can use to further a film composition career is to understand story and realize that music is just one of several departments that are employed to make a visual project of some sort. And everybody in the filmmaking process, the director, the producer, the screenwriter, the set design, the gaffer, the grip, the special effects, they are all there in service of realizing the story that the director is trying to tell. And music just operates one vertical in that production hierarchy. What I was trying to say is that musicians tend to look at everything from a musical perspective as opposed to saying, I'm a filmmaker adding music to this project. And that I feel it takes a lot of discipline, and why there's so few people who actually succeed is it's difficult to make that transition to jump the shark, so to speak, to say I'm no longer just a musician. I am a filmmaker using music to tell a story. And that's if you can get that together, then you understand what it means to be a film composer.
You know, it's funny you should mention that. When I first moved to Los Angeles, I got a couple of gigs composing for some small indie films. I actually wasn't trying to get them. I just kind of fell into it, believe it or not. And one of the things I found was that I did what I thought was these great scores, and the director would come in and change everything around. And I was so upset about it. And it took a while to really realize, well, wait a second, this has nothing to do with my music. This has everything to do with what the director wants. But it's a different mindset to think that way.
Yeah, absolutely it is. Yeah, and it's what I've kind of been my mission to express that opinion, that it is a different mindset and what that means and how to communicate. Because listen, at the end of the day, a director is thinking about a zillion things at once. On a film set, they've got people asking them questions incessantly, 24 hours a day. So what most musicians fail to recognize and accept is that a director will be talking a different language, and they talk the language of story. So as a musician, I found it much more successful to talk in terms of story, characterization, sets, lighting, what the plot is, all of those different story elements, as a way of creating a common ground where the musician can then interpret the vision of the director to get a suitable result. If you don't have a common language, if you say, well, I think that should be a B flat 7 sharp 5 instead of a flat 5 chord, and the director will look at you like you're nuts. They will have no idea what you're talking about. However, if you were to say wrap that particular question around how it relates to and involves and affects a character, the director will be all over that. And now you have a common language that you can communicate. Otherwise, you're speaking two different languages, and maybe you're lucky enough to hit a home run by the way you emotionally interpret a scene. But it's very difficult to have a conversation with a filmmaker talking solely in musical terms. The virtue of using an English horn versus an oboe will be completely lost on a director.
Yeah, I get it.
But the converse is true as well. If you understand what motivates that character and how it relates to the story, you're golden. And now you can get to work and get something done.
Okay, you've been teaching film composition for a while now. What is it, 5 years?
This will be my 6th year, yes.
6th year, okay. I guess that begs the question then, how do you teach someone film composition?
Well, people do it in different ways. Based on my experience in the film business, I make a point to have everything technical and informational to be available to the student outside of class. So to that end, I've built websites that have curated as well as original content that the student can then refer to on their own time. Our class time is spent speaking in the language of story, and I don't talk about music at all. We'll listen, review, and critique, and express ideas based on how does that musical idea relate to the character, and how is it helping the story. So I found that to be very successful in my experience, because it helps students, cross that divide to start thinking about the music that they write in relationship to how it affects the story, as opposed to, oh my gosh, I'm so emotional about this melody, isn't it great? That's really irrelevant. If it's fitting the story, if it's getting the emotion of the story across, then who am I to say what genre of music is appropriate or not? That's a personal taste issue. But if you can apply a musical genre in a way that fulfills the needs of the story, then you're on the nose, as opposed to trying to force feed your emotional idea into it. It comes back to that notion of craft versus art.
Well, I think everything in the entertainment business is a combination of both.
Absolutely.
In certain cases, it skews more one way than the other. But that being said, if it's done well, there's that combination, that fine line that, you do have both, I think.
Yeah. Well, of course. I mean, one thing I wanted to say about that is that I encourage my students to learn how to become schizophrenic and be both a participant in the creative process, as well as being an objective observer of their work. And you need to have both to be really great. You can't be one or the other.
Since budgets are going down and they're fairly low, especially on certain types of projects, that means that the film composer is responsible for a lot. And one of the things that also means is where once upon a time you could rely on great engineers for recording and mixing, a lot of it now is on the shoulders of the film composer. So that being said, is there anything special that the film composer should know when it comes to that?
Well, they should understand about acoustics and about sound and about register. So it's kind of all the above all the time. And I encourage everybody to listen to as many different styles of music and to learn how to to analyze different kinds of music, so that that exposure will broaden your palette, and hopefully you'll absorb from audio technical point of view how things are supposed to sound. And then it becomes the chore for the Lone Ranger like myself to figure, well, how do I get my stuff to sound like that? As opposed to being intimidated by that, I don't know anything about this. I'll have to go hire somebody to fix it for me because I just don't know. So it's kind of like from all the above all the time in slow increments to improve your craft across the board. Now, that being said, the standouts are the guys who kind of gravitate towards that. I have a former student, his name's Steven Schwartz. He goes by the name Steven. He's a wonderful composer. He's not interested in film per se, but he's an amazing instrumentalist, programmer, songwriter, performer, and he's figured out how to do it all himself, and he's well over 100 million views on YouTube at this point.
Wow.
So, it's kind of like, there are people who will pop out, and then there are other people like myself who just kind of plod through it and improve your craft. So, it's luck of the draw, I guess. But I guess if I were to offer any advice or suggestions to the people wanting a career as a film composer, keep your ears open and don't be intimidated by what you don't know.
Yeah.
The hardest thing to do is to identify what the problem is. Focus your attention there rather than saying, I don't know what are people going to think about me. Focus, learn how to solve your own problems, and then your craft and the quality of your work will improve.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I think most people that we know that are successful have done that. Certainly for me.
Yeah, without exception, because they're the ones who are committed for the long haul. All of these YouTube or MySpace, as an example, entry-level film composers, they'll get tired of it and they'll move on because it's too hard.
So that being said, There are so many musicians, artists that want to get into film composition. What is the thing or things that most of them don't know?
Well, first and foremost is that it's a collaborative business. It's not, here's my track, do you like it or do you not? You know, from a negotiating standpoint, that puts you in a yes-no decision. You know, it took me a long time to realize that when I'm working with another creative person, especially outside of my genre, I have to be able to communicate with them, and I have to be able to be effective. And I have to be able to learn how not to get defensive if they don't like something of mine, and to be able to work with people effectively. If you know, collaborative skills have gotten hammered pretty hard by the device-centric world we live in today. If you want to work in film, as a film composer, know how to say hello to somebody and look them right in the eye and be able to understand what they're trying to say. You know, I mean, my father years ago, he told me, he says, people work with people they know.
Yeah.
And I think that's still true today because strangers are hard, you know, listen, this is a very intimate process. To write the best music, to make the best movie, to engineer the best record, you know, requires an involvement that is very intimate by the individual. So people are going to gravitate towards people they like, people that they can communicate with, people who understand what they're trying to say. So this notion of collaborative skills is really, really high on the list, because the moment that you say, I'm Johnny Film Composer and I want to score your film, in that instant, you're competing with John Williams. So it's assumed that your skill level will be at a professional level. So what is a differentiator? Well, not everybody can afford John Williams, but if you can connect with a filmmaker and make them feel comfortable so that they trust you, they're going to be more likely to want to work with you. And that's sorely missed by so many people I meet. That it's not, do you like my music? Do you not like my music? Well, I think my music would be great for movies. Well, how in the world does that relate to the story I'm trying to tell?
Yeah.
It really doesn't really mean anything. So what they don't know is that it's a collaborative business, that we're all on equal footing, vying for the same jobs. And so you need to find a way to be able to connect with the people you want to work with in a way that allows them to feel comfortable in that intimate, collaborative environment.
Okay, let's go to another place for a second. Let's talk about music education on a university level. And you've been intimately involved for 6 years, and probably by the time this airs, you will have moved on to your own educational outlet. But let's talk about the college experience for just a little bit, because it's really changing in the fact that everything is so expensive. And now we're beginning to get a pushback from students who are saying, or potential students who are saying, wow, this is way too expensive considering what I get for it. How do you think that's going to change university executive thinking in the future?
As it regards to academia in general, or in music?
Well, let's just go general.
Well, in general, I think academia is in serious, serious trouble. And it's not that it's a combination of people who want to change versus people who are terrified and fearful of change, and the nature of the institution that slows down the process. So on the one hand, you've got all this technology that's pushing forward. You have a new generation of students who've never experienced life without a smartphone, trying to be educated by a bunch of older than them people, most of which in the academic world have never worked on the outside as a professional, who are only regurgitating what they were taught when they were young. So it becomes kind of like this incestuous bubble. And it's the students are revolting because it's no longer relevant. The approach is losing relevance to their lives. They're taught a thing, this is the way the world works, or this is what I think is important, with the subtext of this is what I learned in a book, or this is what I was taught. And it's libraries. Think about libraries. When was the last time you walked into a library? We have the entire world full of information at our fingertips. And that's completely changed the culture, our culture as human beings, but it's also putting extraordinary pressure on academia to respond. You combine that pressure with people who are looking to preserve their jobs, and then invariably it seems from my research that people are circling the wagon, and they're saying, well, we're just going to hunker down and try to weather the storm. But the students are saying, many students are saying to me, says, I'd love to go to grad school, but it's too expensive.
Yeah.
So there's kind of a mismatch between the administrative side of it, which is saying, okay, we have to preserve the status quo to stay in business, and then their customer base pushing off in a different direction. I was looking at an academic job not too long ago, a potential academic job. And I ran across a strategic planning report saying, what is the status of colleges? And that really piqued my interest. So I read through this document, and I got to the point where it got to the finances. The elite schools that are 100% endowed will have no pressure or feel no pressure from this coming disruption. There is a significant number of schools that are reliant upon tuition revenue to stay in business who will go bankrupt. And then there's all the rest are all in the middle somewhere. And what they discovered was these schools were making bets on their future by investing in real estate and new buildings, and at the same time discounting tuition to attract students. So you have an industry which is increasing their debt load while reducing their revenue. And that is not a prescription for successful business. So I can't give you any kind of indication as to what the future will look like, other than to say that there's an enormous gap in the marketplace where you have the institutions and the elite schools who will do what they do. You have people suffering on the bottom end who have no education. And then you have this big hole in the middle where people are looking for the information, they're looking for the education, and they can no longer rely upon, you have to go to, the path to upward mobility is to go to college. That may or may not apply. So we have young people who are looking for the avenue that suits them best to fulfill their needs. What I've decided that for myself personally that I can do is to take the courses that I developed in academia and for a fraction of the cost be able to make those available to people who want that kind of education, and we'll see how that ends up. One of the things I did learn from my educational experience is that this notion that education is a tube sock is a myth. Everyone learns differently. And so the breaking apart of academia could very well be segmenting into different styles of learning that are more specific to somebody's learning preferences or abilities, as opposed to funneling everybody through a tube sock kind of system.
What's interesting about that, you should say that. I have some good friends who their daughter was applying to colleges, and that in itself was an ordeal. And it was different when we went to school, or we were of that age, where it was fairly easy, where you yourself, the student, filled out this submission form and did it, the application. And now it's definitely a parent-child proposition that everybody has to do this. It's an ordeal. That being said, she got into her favorite college, which is Colorado College. And the interesting thing was they have sequential learning. So you take a class and you take that one class only and you take it for whatever it is, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, and then you're finished with that forever. And then you go on to the next one, which makes so much sense when you think about it because, you only concentrate on that one thing for that period of time. It's one of those head smack things where you go, well, why doesn't everybody do this? It makes a lot more sense. The military does it, and they're very successful in getting their people up to speed to do whatever they have to do. But yet academia is still in this mode where, it's, hundreds of years old.
Yeah, it's a structure that is sacrosanct. And the structure is what needs to be broken apart. It's, I from the beginning of my experience in academia, I was constantly reminded of the seminal book, The Innovator's Dilemma. And for those who are not aware of this book, it's basically saying a status quo business, and people have different takeaways of this, but my takeaway of this is if you focus on a small group of people and you ignore a bunch of other people, then the culture will change to accommodate the needs of the majority that is no longer part of that inner few, and will disrupt the status quo. This is a broad generalization of the book, which I highly recommend. But what was so eloquently stated in that book was the fact that even if a status quo business, let's say, or industry, could see the change coming, their corporate culture would not be able to make that transition. And this is why I'm firmly of the belief that academia is really in trouble. You got people on the inside who want to do change. They want to, most teachers want to help students. That's why they become teachers. But it's just the institutional nature of the industry that prevents them from making those changes, even if they want to. So, in the last couple of weeks, my attitude has shifted dramatically in saying that, okay, we've kind of been in the dark ages for the last 15, 20 years as technology is grown at this pace. Now we're on the edge of even perhaps having another enlightenment where everything's going to change. And it's a little too soon to tell exactly what that will look like, but I just have this overriding sense that we're at the dawn of something. Now, yeah. I would love to be 20 years old to be at the beginning of this ride, but I won't have that opportunity. So I tend to tell my students, this is an incredibly exciting period of time to be alive because it's all going to be new. And you get to make up the rules and you get to decide for yourselves what you want this to be. It's crazy times.
Okay, speaking of new, do you want to talk about your new course?
Yeah, I would be happy to. Thank you for asking. I had a long career as a professional composer, arranger, musician, and I came to academia as to pay a moral debt to my mentor and the people who helped me along the way. And not being a trained academic or not being a part of that club all of my life, I came to academia with a much different mindset. And I was all full of the Khan Academy and all the rest of that, saying, well, let's go boil the ocean and do something different. And for that reason, I developed a hybrid teaching process, which I described earlier in the sense that information is curated so that the pertinent information is in one place on a dedicated website for that class, as opposed to saying, go find the answer to X, Y, Z, and then everybody comes back with a different Google search result. This enables a hybrid or a discussion-based class period. And in the case of the film scoring class, we talk about film, we talk about the story, we talk about the relationship between all the different parties, creating a common language, knowing who you're working with, and how they relate to what you do so that you can walk into a meeting and understand what everybody's role is. That was the basis of the class. So I've spent the last 6 years teaching and refining this process. And now that I've decided to leave academia, I've taken that same course that has worked very, very well and reconfigured it in a online format with a series of videos. Of the curated content is also available as part of this package. And what I've learned about distance learning is that and education in general, is what students crave, and why my classes seem to always fill up, is personalized attention, meaning that you have an expert who is addressing your specific issues. And in that group setting, there's an enormous amount of peer learning that goes on between each student and or the similarities and problems that need to be addressed. For that reason, this online film scoring class is going to have this baked into the process a series of webinars for that classroom experience for the people who take the course, so that they not only do they get all of the background information, knowledge, and context, and the personalized instruction in the form of videos, but they also get personalized feedback. And I purposely decided to go that direction because a talking head is really ineffective in an educational format. I mean, it's astonishing to think that MOOCs, which were all the rage when I first started teaching, had a less than 10% completion rate and a less than 10% pass rate.
Wow, I had no idea.
It enabled, yeah, it's crazy. So you get a lot of people who sign up and then they lose interest. Well, why do they lose interest? Because nobody's paying attention to them. They're left to their own devices. Now, here's the thing. It's like when this whole tube sock educational approach, is kind of reminiscent of Hollywood thinking the computer was a new screen for them to distribute their content in the early 90s. This tube sock approach and what MOOCs ended up being is just an extension of what they did in the classroom, thinking that it was good enough. Well, the culture's moved on. The culture has changed. The youth of today have different needs. They have different wants. They have their world is completely different. So that extending what has gone on in the classroom no longer fits. So for that reason, I realized that if I was going to do this and have an impact, it would be I'd have to be personally involved. So not only are they paying for the information, the curated information, they're paying for time with me.
What's the name of it?
It's called Chris Boardman Masterclasses, Film Scoring Masterclass. There is a pre-launch sign-up page on my website, which is chrisboardmanmediagroup.com. And there's at this moment, there's no obligation. I'm just trying to gauge interest. And I'll be rolling out the launch plans here once the semester is over.
Okay.
And now I'm sure that doesn't necessarily relate to this conversation, but there is a masterclass tab on my website where they can find it.
Last question, Chris. And this is something I didn't get a chance to ask you the first time around. What's the best piece of business advice that maybe you've learned along the way or maybe someone imparted to you?
Be honest, because even though we're spread out across the globe, this is a very small community of people. And if you are not straight ahead, if you're not ethical, if you don't stand behind your words, if you are not honest in your dealings, it will come back to bite you in the butt. And now, in the world we live in now with trolls and bots, you can get destroyed in a matter of seconds. So as painful as it might be straight ahead, be honest, be accountable for your actions, and you will find your way. Because once you lose your reputation, you're done. And that begs all sorts of other questions about saying yes to something even if you're not qualified because you're so desperate to get ahead, and all the rest of that. You can go down a whole rabbit hole about that, but we need not do that here. But yeah, just be straight ahead, be honest, be a real person, and realize that you're dealing with people, and the golden rule and all of that sort of thing. You may not get every gig, you may not reach the heights of fame and fortune and notoriety that you wish, but that part of it's out of your control.
You can find out a lot more about Chris by going to chrisboardmanmusic.com. That's Chris, C-H-R-I-S, Boardman, B-O-A-R-D-M-A-N, music.com. It's all one word, chrisboardmanmusic.com. To find out more about his masterclass in film scoring, go to cbmg.mykajabi.com, and you can find that link in the show notes of the podcast. Thanks for listening and being in my inner circle. Remember, if you have any questions or comments, you can send them to questions@BobbyOInnerCircle.com. To listen to other episodes of Bobby Owsinski's Inner Circle, go to BobbyOwsinski.com and select the podcast tab, or go to BobbyOInnerCircle.com, or find it on iTunes, Stitcher, Mixcloud, and Google Play. At BobbyOwsinski.com and BobbyOInnerCircle.com, you'll also find a sign-up form for my newsletter and for alerts for new podcasts. This is Bobby Owsinski. I will see you next time.